I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Sias Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome to Arcane Mark, Mechanics of Peril, Design Diaries. So today we're going to be talking about how to design in a tabletop RPG, not just for like any old situation that could happen during your game, but for peril, for when things are getting tough. And there's multiple ways of defining that, and different tabletop RPGs categorize it in different ways. So I want to talk about lots of different ways to define Mechanics of Peril, not just the way that it's done in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and what that tells you about the tabletop RPG and its goals and some of the sort of psychological and social contract effects of some of the Mechanics of Peril.
Because the Mechanics of Peril in general are going to be showing a rising stakes and the either actual consequences or some kind of a tracker that builds up toward consequences of some kind.
That's right. So when you think about Mechanics of Peril, in general, many tabletop RPGs have something similar to hit points or like stress that you can take, or some kind of form of ablation that you can take before you're suffering lasting consequences for being hit by things. If they don't have something like that, they're usually extremely deadly. And they're like very realistic. If you get hit at all, you could get infected and die from, even if you're a very powerful character. But even very deadly systems and OSR systems, other things like that, and like the system they're based on, like original Dungeons & Dragons, have some kind of hit points that you can take before something starts happening to you. So in that sense, it's kind of a cushion before you're really, really in peril.
But sometimes even those trackers will have like a small part of them where you're fine, and then as you progress further into that tracker, other things start to go wrong.
You take penalties, you start to take consequences. That could be a death spiral. There's also systems like 4th Edition D&D or Fabula Ultima, where it notes that you're down on hit points or like below half, say, by being bloodied in 4E or in Crisis in Fabula Ultima, or lots of other systems have this, where you're not actually at a penalty causing you to have a death spiral in those systems, but you have gone below, and that is a game term, and therefore there can be abilities that you can only use when you're below half, or that enemies get a bonus because they sense blood in the water against you when you're below half, or things like that. Just like it opens up different gameplay options when you're getting closer to a dangerous situation. And so that's why the way that games define peril can change depending on what they emphasize. So in those games where your game state can change by a significant amount when you're below half, then being below half is just much more significant, and you think about it every time that you go below half. And so that's what I meant when I said at the beginning of the episode that the way the Mechanics of Peril work can help you with change your own psychology and even the social contract at the table around peril in the game.
Yeah, because if you have a system where, you know, you're losing 5 dice because you're losing dice that you roll because, or taking huge penalties or other things like that because you are getting low, then getting low, there is that kind of death spiral thing where you're going to be considering, once you get weak, like what is your means for retreat? Can you get out of this situation?
A death spiral system heavily encourages ambushes and engaging at a distance that is bad for your opponent. Kiting, ambushing, anything where you can't be attacked is good, because if you can be attacked, even if it's unlikely to hit you, it could hit you and cause the death spiral to give you penalties.
Another thing that you can have with those tracks of being hit is that sometimes you have ways of being hit that are worse than others. You have some kind of concept of non-lethal damage or something similar where, like, you know, whether it's a separate track that goes down at the same time as your lethal damage, or I'm thinking
There's some systems where there's a type of damage that ignores the ablation part.
yes,
Where it's just like, I think there was one or more Star Wars RPGs that were just like, you've got these, I don't remember the name for both of the tracks, but you've got these essentially stamina type stuff that you're not really being hit, that makes up for, like, in a Star Wars movie when they're shooting at you and you're getting tired, but they somehow miss a million times.
yes,
And then a small number of actual wounds for when you actually got hit. And things are always bad when you're losing them, and certain abilities just went directly to those. And so you can have things like that.
And another thing when you have those multiple types is that they could have different consequences. Like, one type might be pretty easy to shake off by getting a little bit of rest, but another type might take much longer to recover from.
That's true. And usually when you get to the bad ones that you don't want to go to, those are the ones that are hard to recover from. And you can have both tiers of that. Like, for instance, in Fate, where you've got stress, which if you take that, that's no problem. But then you have, like, mild, moderate, and major consequences. Or they may have slightly different names than that, maybe severe or minor. And each of those can help allow you to sort of take a hit and reduce the amount of stress that it would deal to an amount that you can handle instead of dying, but they each progressively get rid of more stress for you on the hit, but are harder to remove and more debilitating.
Yes.
So, if you take a major consequence, that's going to be there for a really long time. Like, Linda and I were playing one where, like, one of her characters, I think, had to take one and was just, like, walking in a stretcher for, like, multiple entire adventures.
Walking in a stretcher, like on crutches, I think it was. Or like,
it was like being carried in a stretcher.
Right, not walking. Yeah,
that's what I meant. Like, people were carrying you in a stretcher, and then they had crutches after that.
That's right.
Yes, like, it's like you could be there, but you couldn't even walk.
Yes,
it was a particularly nasty major consequence.
Yes, but that's definitely one of those where it's like, welp. The character would have died, but instead.
Yep.
Type things. So that's another thing too. In general, is like, how does what mechanics does the system have for a situation where the character otherwise would have died, or otherwise would have had some kind of a terrible thing happen to them? So, like, to go back to Fabula Ultima for a moment, when you're reduced to 0 hit points and taken out of the fight, it's like, well, you can have something bad happen, or, you could choose that your character dies, but usually you're going to choose, like, okay, something bad happens to them, and then you move forward from there.
Yeah, so this is not just a small part of an appetizer we did at the beginning about hit points and going down. Mm-hmm. This is the clutch, the main thrust of talking about mechanics of Peril, which is, what do you do at the end of the line? Yes. Where someone's going to die, some horrible consequences are going to happen. Now, what Linda described is a type of mechanic that is, I think, becoming more popular in some indie RPGs. Fabula Ultima has it. Daggerheart, what they showed off of what they have with Critical Role, also doing that. There's many others where you just basically say, all right, at this point you could choose to die and do something really outrageously cool and now you're dead. Mm-hmm. Or you can stay alive and various something bad happens to you depending on the system. Like, in Fabula Ultima, you're definitely out of the fight. You're not coming back in, and a bad thing from a list of bad things happens. In some systems, you may suffer like a permanent like debilitation that lowers your statistics forever, and you can't get rid of it. Mm-hmm. Just whatever it is, it's either something negative now or something positive now and you're dead.
Or it could be, it doesn't have to be a physical consequence. Sometimes it might be like a reputational consequence, or like a loss of
It depends on the system.
Yeah.
In Fabula Ultima,
loss of a resource, or...
In Fabula Ultima, it's never a permanent stat decrease, mm-hmm. but in some systems it is a permanent stat decrease. So it depends on which system you're playing, what they're going to do to you for choosing not to die. Now, obviously, that is on one end, whereas like OD&D, you die at 0 hit points. There is no rule for what happens at that point. It's a system that a lot of people understand because it was one of the first RPGs, but it makes very little sense in some ways because it has all cushion where nothing happens, and then suddenly
fine, dead.
Yes, it's got the system is only cushion with no consequences, and then the ultimate consequence, which is generally the most boring way that you can create mechanics of peril because there's all sorts of things you can do to a character that are worse than death if you're a scheming and tricksy enough GM for certain. So
yeah, and it could, because also like depending upon the game you're playing too, it could be one that doesn't have it could be one where the consequence lasts for a shorter amount of time or is more of a narrative consequence where it's like, okay, yeah, you're defeated here, like your characters didn't die, but they also didn't succeed at that objective that they were aiming toward.
That's right. There's all sorts of narrative consequences
with so like with Mouse Guard, for example, at the beginning of the encounter, each side sets the stakes of what's going to happen.
But often, if it's a predator, their stakes is they're going to eat you.
Yeah. So. But then you have some flexibility there, but where it's like, if the predator, does one side get like a really resounding victory or like a little bit of a victory or whatever, and then like, so what are you going to concede toward so if you like lose by a little bit, what are you going to concede toward the objectives of the enemy?
Yep. So if the snake says, I'm going to eat all the mice, and then it wins, but only by a little bit, then maybe it only gets to eat some of the mice.
Or maybe it gets one of the mouse's tail, or maybe...
Or it eats the mouse's arm, and the mouse gets away. And the snake is like, one arm of one mouse is like a really bad compromise for me, but sure.
But like the GM and the players discuss together, like, what do they want to have? What do they think is fair? Because if you lose, like, you should lose something in that case.
That's true. Whereas... like, I feel like it just nipped off the tip of someone's tail or something like that, or, like, poisoned them and they're weakened is something like if the mice won, but only by a little bit.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's exactly a way that you deal with Peril and Mouse Guard. It's the most complicated part of Mouse Guard by far is when things get really perilous and you're in one of those... conflicts. And other than that, it's pretty freeform with very fail forward at all stages.
Yeah.
So basically, the stakes are higher
like
whenever you're in the mechanics of peril.
Okay, I could also see like the mice were going in to protect another group of mice from the snake, and maybe the snake doesn't get one of the PC mice, but the snake eats another mouse that they were trying to protect.
If there are other mice.
If there are other mice or whatever, yeah. So there's a lot of possible things that you can do with that, and it's gonna. I'm saying that too because it's like depending upon what is the situation, right? There may be that example of like consequences that don't hit the PCs directly physically, but also can represent, oh crud, we lost.
And usually killing them is the most boring way to show a consequence. But it's also can be boring if for some players if they literally know that they can't die no matter what. And that there will be essentially no consequences for what goes on. That's why many of these systems have other consequences that are added in. Because you want to have some tension. And some players definitely want to play a game where it is possible for their characters to be defeated or to be killed. And depending on which game you play, obviously... that's what I was talking about before about like the social contract of the game being affected. It's very heavily by the mechanics of peril, because many games have a pretty harsh forced retirement or character death mechanic that are in them somewhere, right? Like Blades in the Dark, if your character gets too stressed out, you will eventually be forced to stop. And
in that case, like you can have things that are consequences that build up over time that can't necessarily be bladed or diminished. If you get to a certain point, it's like you have a pool of strikes, and once you've hit enough of those, your character is out.
Right, or in Myth Ender, where it's actually more non-deterministic, because as the fight is going on, you not only could get killed by the god who's fighting you, but also more likely than that, you will draw enough power that you risk becoming one of the same gods you're trying to destroy at the end. So usually you'll have at least somebody who has some chance on a d6, some number they can roll, that they would wind up becoming a god, which is a bad end for their character. And so in that case, you have two choices, which is that one of the other characters can kill them before you roll the d6 to see if they fully became a god, and just kill them right away. Or you roll the d6 and hope that it doesn't go against the character, and if it does, since you hesitated to kill them,
then they became a god.
They became a god and have enough time to get away, and now you'll have to fight them someday. So, like, definitely, when Linda and I played Myth Ender, Linda was playing a couple characters, and one of her characters became Thor because of just vastly overusing god powers. And even then, it didn't actually have that high of a chance. I think it was like 1 in 3 or 1 in 6.
Yeah, it wasn't super high, but it still happened. It was funny.
And became Thor. So that's just, sometimes you become Thor. It's just what happens. So basically, the mechanics of Peril they kind of, not just did they affect the social contract of the players and GM, but they kind of are their own social contract between the game and the GM and the players about, like,
what are the stakes? What can happen to your characters?
It's a contract about what can happen, what is the limit, what is the extent, how and where could it happen. And some games are even more lenient than the ones that literally say that you can't die unless you choose to, and you just get a consequence if you stay alive. I remember we were playing at, like, the 5e playtest, and it was even more lenient than that, because the cleric healing ability was a free action at will if it was used on an unconscious creature. It only brought them to 1, but they brought to 1, they woke up and they stood up with all of their weapons.
So we had the cleric in the center of a pile of...
Linda maxed out her AC.
Yes.
And she was basically a puppeteer. We were all her little marionettes, because we wound up in the playtest going to a really dangerous area that was far beyond what anybody should have been fighting. Just by accident. And it was clearly should have been lethal, but basically what would happen is that we got surrounded by way stronger enemies. But, they only had 1 attack. So Linda basically stood in the center, and then she free action. We had a lot of players in the group. She free action brought back all the marionettes who stood up, surrounding her with a human body shield at 1 hit point. And then she took her turn. And so then, basically, all of us went, like, kind of shortly after her. So then we would do 1 turn, but stay body blocking her. And then the enemies would keep going until they hit us, which they usually, but not always did. It generally took all of them to bring all our 1 hit point people back down. And sometimes, if they were lucky, they would get a swing on Linda and miss because she maxed out her AC. Or occasionally... they would hit her somewhat, but she would heal herself up after that.
So then mechanics like that, when it's just like going down and then popping back up again. That sort of thing was an influence when you're thinking about, like, Pathfinder 2nd edition and, like, how to...
I mean, even the modern, fully developed 5e has some yo-yo concerns where basically the 3rd edition Death and Dying was probably one of the worst Death and Dying since, I mean, I guess it's the same as all of the D&D Death and Dying mechanics were better than dying at 0 hit points.
But you had this
up through 3rd, they were very not good, because you had a tiny window where you wouldn't die that probably you didn't fall into.
Yeah, and we House Rule expanded it, but still.
We used Monty Cook's House Rule, where it was expanded to your con, and it was still too small.
Yeah, so you'd be like so that range of like con modifier was where you would be staggered, and then when you got to full negative con, you would die.
Yes. And so, in fourth edition that was changed, and fifth edition is kind of more similar to fourth edition in that way, where there's some number of death saves to see if you die, and otherwise you will not die unless you take such massive numbers of damage that it's basically impossible to take it while you're down. And then when you get brought up, you get, like, back immediately and everything is fine. So in Pathfinder 2nd edition, if you yo-yo back up, you get the wounded condition, which is really deadly, and you're in big trouble if you go down again. And so that's one that's more of, if you think of it, it is a less narrative version in some ways of the idea of go do something heroic. Sure, but you might die instead of you automatically die and do the heroic thing in some of these other indie systems. Or stay safely unconscious out of the fight, and you probably won't die. Although you still might, especially if AoE attacks are constantly everywhere.
And then to think again about like the World of Darkness style games where you do have like these different types of damage, and then healing effects are going to have different efficacy against different types of damage. So if you've taken aggravated damage, some healing effects might not be able to heal it at all, or heal like 1 point, whereas no matter how much they would have healed of other types.
World of Darkness is a good example of a death spiral, because you take penalties any time that you get hit and you can't soak it with your armor. And it's also very tenuous because there's very little space between getting knocked out and being killed. Granted, there's the thing right before being knocked out gives you so much of a penalty that you can barely fight at all.
And what that does mean is that if you fall into that thing, your opponents are probably going to ignore you in favor of other people because you just can't do it.
Unless you're really, really good at your main fighting thing.
Yeah.
Basically, you have some number of dice from, if you're not familiar with the system, from like 1, if you are like literally like you are just like the worst you could possibly be at that category of thing. Like if it's perception, then you're like the character on the TV show who just doesn't notice anything that's standing right in front of them and walks past it.
Yeah.
And you don't have the skill at all. You have 1, which is most average people would have 2 if they were untrained.
Yes.
And 10 is the most you can have, except for that there's like some weird stuff you can do to have more if you're like a vampire, which you probably are.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have like 10 plus and you're losing 5 for being crippled, then maybe you actually can still do something. But if you're not, then you're kind of out of the fight. So, Dustin has a question, which is, any thoughts on mitigating player death or unconsciousness by telling a friend who set aside time to be with your group, or because it is telling a friend who set aside time to be with your group, you can't participate in our game for the rest of the night.
Well, sometimes you have the ability to have that player have the ability to play an NPC.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that NPC was with the group directly, or whether it's like, oh yeah, crud, they had the situation come up with this character who died and they went back and they got assistance from someone else that they're gonna play.
Like, the problem is, ultimately, you can't even have a game with incapacitation if you're worried about that. Like, one time I went to the game store to play Pathfinder Society, and with my archer with ridiculously, PF1, ridiculously high saves, very high AC. She was like level 10 or 11, and she'd never really run into any issues up until that point. She got hit by a power word stun, and she was stunned for like 10 rounds by an enemy that was also using reverse gravity, and like she was the one range character, so she was the right choice to stun, for sure. I was out of the game though for long enough that I like left to go grab lunch, and I came back and I was still stunned. So like, it is what it is. That wasn't death or unconscious. That was just having incapacitating effects in the game. So some systems attempt to avoid the one of your friends can't do anything right now by removing all things that incapacitate or take over your character, such that the GM has to control them or take you out of the game. And you can make a system like that, and they're often still really fun. But if you're trying to run a system like Pathfinder or D&D that tend to have some of these debilitating effects that do take someone out, hard CC, hard crowd control, essentially, or death or unconsciousness, you kind of can't avoid it. Like Linda said, maybe there's another character you can play, but in the middle of a fight when you're stunned, probably not.
I was thinking about, like, if your character, like, actually died and you don't have time to build... Well, one of the things that you can do sometimes then is have them help you as the GM with certain things, so they still have ways that they can engage with what's going on and participate.
For example, when I was running a playtest for PF2, we were playing with Mike Sayer was playing his monk Cobra, who had incredibly bad armor class, but always used positioning to survive, despite having, like, way worse than, like, the wizard.
Mm-hmm.
And he had his greatest challenge ever when Luis's character was killed and decapitated by a Dullahan, who then raised Luis's character as a shadow hound in his service. And I let Luis play the hound. And first of all, that was Luis's first character who has ever died in any campaign, apparently. And in that death in Pathfinder playtest is the only death I've done in Pathfinder PF2 playtest or PF2. I haven't killed anyone in PF2.
Including in long-running campaign.
That's right. Luis is the only person I've killed in either the playtest or PF2. But that's mostly because it was an ability that instantly killed you if it brought you to 0 hit points. Luis decided that Cobra the monk had escaped for too long. So no matter how many actions he had to spend to chase after Cobra when Mike was moving around the battlefield, he spent those actions. And Cobra was in big trouble at that point because finally he met someone who cared about killing him more than they cared about anything else. And it was close to a TPK because of the fact that Cobra moved around enough that it just didn't seem worthwhile to attack him, but actually attacking him was the right strategy for if an enemy had watched every fight with him, like Luis had.
Because like his adventuring companion.
Yes, then you would know. Whereas no enemy would reasonably know, oh yeah, I should waste lots of my actions to make sure I get to Cobra.
Yes.
And yeah, it was rough. It was also partially rough because Linda was like, we were playing after work, and so, it was like 11, and Linda was still working because she was in organized play. And so at that point, it was getting so rough that, like, they came over because we were at the office playing to Linda's desk. And they're like, Linda, we need your character to come in really fast to this Dullahan encounter. Luis is eating us. And so Linda came in with her war priest of Gorham and just wrecked everything and then left and went back to her desk and worked again.
Yep. Looks like you guys are having some trouble. Healing. Attack.
Yes, they did cast Summon Linda 7. That's right. And to be fair, like, it wasn't that she was more powerful than everyone else. It was also that she was at full and had all my resources because
I hadn't come to the session, so I came in completely fresh and was just like, oh hi, I'm here now. But that was pretty funny having him come over to my desk and be like, help, save us.
Yes. To be fair, the ability to create those shadow hounds and the fact that I added 2 encounters together, it was an extreme encounter without the ability to create the shadow hounds, so it makes sense that it was the only time I've killed a character.
Yeah, I mean, you were playtesting something being really bored.
Like I wasn't planning on playtesting it being bored. The Dullahan himself was not that many levels above the party. The problem is he had a lot of hounds, and the party managed to, like, pull 2 encounters together with his hounds and the Dullahan. I mean, he didn't come out at the beginning of the fight, but they did manage to do that, and he could create more hounds. So it eventually added up. It was one of those death spirals we were talking about earlier in the episode, but it was saved by Linda.
And another thing you can do too is, like, if the character is definitely dead, set aside some time during the session for talking about the new character that's going to come on board and engaging your other players in it. And like sort of how do they want their new character to join and things like that. And do they want that character to have connections to others? Because having, character death can be pretty disruptive. And it's like, oh, wait, what am I going to do now? And so doing sort of that mini session 0 type thing with the new character that's coming on board and the other players getting involved in it and having that be part of what you do, even if it's like, oh yeah, you're moving forward what you're doing for a little bit, and then you pause that to be like, all right, yeah, how are things going with this character build? Or any more thoughts on this, and then chat about stuff.
Another thing you can do, even if your system doesn't explicitly have that death and dying roll of either you die or you do something else that's bad and you survive, you could just add that, not as a mechanic, but in the story. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when Linda's character at one point was like probably going to die and was approached by Pazuzu, who always wanted to sacrifice her, just that was a plot hook. Mm-hmm. The plot hook was that Linda's character was the daughter of Chopper's last victim in Sandpoint, and the Chopper had wanted to kill her too as the final sacrifice to Pazuzu, and due to like this connection and her fate being averted, she became a part Psychopomp. This was before Linda wrote Duskwalkers, but we were using my third-party part Psychopomp that were not the same as Duskwalkers, where they were like someone who was having a second chance, but were instead just like touched by death for a different reason. And so Pazuzu kind of always wanted to sacrifice or take control of Linda's character, and so she eventually gave in and called for Pazuzu to get her out of the situation.
And Pazuzu definitely annihilated the thing that we were fighting, but then, like, my character was possessed by Pazuzu, and
yep,
that was a problem. And she very nearly died from that.
She managed to get out of being possessed by Pazuzu, but only when she was in the middle of, like, an icy area that was far from the party, and she almost died from hypothermia. Mm-hmm. So
never had a conversation before about like, so how much fire could you make like my character was an archer too. It's like, all right, well, how much fire could I make if I turn all of my arrows into firewood?
That's right. That's right. So basically, you can come up with ways to avert death that involve more interesting consequences than dying, even if you're in a system that normally has dying be the only results. But you need to kind of bring it into the narrative. It has to make sense. Like, if Pazuzu just appeared out of nowhere, it'd be like, this is a Diabolus Ex Machina. But it wasn't, because
Pazuzu had been whispering in my character's ear.
And there, Pazuzu, like, this was Jade Region, so Pazuzu, like, people who worship Pazuzu show up a little bit too, and there was a connection to it, and Pazuzu was actually, like, tempting Linda to do it. It's like, oh, you're not gonna be able to win, the undead are gonna win, because she hated undead.
The most.
Now, there are gonna be so many undead, and Linda's like, there can't be undead, ah, Pazuzu, 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 Pazuzu.
The little raccoon in the party was horrified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but another thing is, like, in, when I was running Kingmaker, I set up from the beginning the expectation that the first time that any character would die, that I would instead roll on a chart of long-term consequences, because I was thinking, well, this campaign really wants to have the same PCs for a long time, for many years, and so, like, losing a PC who's like, oh, that's the one who's been doing things for years in this campaign.
Yep.
I didn't want that to happen early on.
It only happened once. It was early on, so it was good that she had that role, because she turned Tartuk into a summoner, and Eidolon, and they killed, together with their kobold traps and stuff, killed the druid. So he wound up having, like, an injured arm that gave him a -1 to attack rolls.
Yeah. And he'd been playing as, like, more of a melee druid, and then he switched to... He had really high stats overall, but he then switched to, like, a spellcasting druid after that.
That's right. So, that's what happened, because... And that was between that aspect and the druid, whose name was Perrin, went on a killing spree of mites, and then, like, later saw the non-combatant mites after he attacked downed mites that we defeated, and then he was, like, reflecting in a parent-like way, like in the Wheel of Time, I guess, on his rage and whether he needed to like chill out a little bit.
Yeah.
So between that and his injury, he was like, "This is a message from Erastil that I need to approach things differently." So there's a lot of ways to deal with peril, and I guess what I'm saying is a final consequence is usually your last resort.
Yes.
Did you have anything else about Mechanics of Peril, Linda?
No, I think that covers what I was thinking of.
All right. So let's say goodbye to YouTube and then figure out this poll. Bye, YouTube.
Bye!